Hi, welcome back. We're going to continue on here with ancient Egypt and Judaism, specifically looking at the geography, culture, and the Old Kingdom. In part one, we focused heavily on the geography piece. We talked about the Nile, we talked about its advantages and disadvantages, we talked a little bit about the desert, and we also talked about Narmer, who was the first to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. So what we want to focus on here in part two is really this time period called the Old Kingdom, which is also really called the Age of Pyramids because that's when all the pyramids were built. But we're also going to focus very heavily on the culture of ancient Egypt. That will be certainly a mainstay as the Old Kingdom turns into the Middle Kingdom and ultimately the New Kingdom. So let's take a look at the Old Kingdom and the culture of Egypt here. So the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is also known as the Age of Pyramids. As I just mentioned, all the pyramids were built during this time period. No pyramids were built after the Old Kingdom, so it's very appropriate for us to call that the Age of Pyramids. Certainly the Egyptians will build a lot of cool stuff in the Middle and New Kingdom, but they just won't build pyramids. So the Old Kingdom lasted from 2660 to 2180 BC, and it's when many patterns for the Egyptian civilization were established. So when we talk about mummies and hieroglyphics and the ruling of pharaohs and the building of afterlife temples, all that started in the Old Kingdom. So it really is the cultural beginning of this civilization. Like I said, most of the pyramids were built in this time period. And we know that a pyramid is an immense stone structure often built as tombs. You saw this in Engineering and Empire, and we're going to take a quick look at a couple of those pyramids here in just a minute. But you have to think about this. These were built by slaves. They would have taken a very long time, years and years and years to build. Certainly would have taken a lot of trial and error because they didn't get it right the first time when they tried to build these things. And oftentimes they had these really amazing burial chambers inside of them that were meant to house the pharaoh they were built for. So let's start by looking at this one here. You've seen it because it was in Engineering and Empire. Djoser builds the step pyramid, and this is really one of the first attempts at a true pyramid. They don't quite succeed as it never really had the smooth sides that a true pyramid would have, but this is really meant to be one of the first attempts at a true pyramid. So you can see by the steps on the outside, that's where it gets its name. The next one we looked at, or actually two of them in Engineering Empire, come from Snefru. So Snefru built the bent pyramid over here. Now if you recall, when we saw this, part of the reason that they had to change angles abruptly is because they thought it's possible that they had built this on unsteady bedrock, and so inside the burial chamber itself they started to see big cracks. That's obviously from the immense weight from all the stone that's on top of this, and so they thought to lighten the load of the actual pyramid itself, they had to change the angle, so that saved them building material. So that's the bent pyramid built by Snefru. Snefru also built the red pyramid, which you can see here. A lot of people think this is the first true pyramid ever built because it actually achieved the true pyramid shape that they wanted. The step pyramid and the bent pyramid came very close, but didn't quite achieve that. Now I've got a little bit of a association that I can help you with to try to remember who built what. I don't know if this is going to be perfect, but I remember that Djoser, if we go back a slide here, Djoser comes first in the alphabet. D comes before S. So if you're trying to remember who built the first pyramid, Djoser comes before Snefru. And so if you can then remember Djoser built the step pyramid, you'll be in good shape. So just remember Djoser comes before Snefru in the alphabet. Djoser comes before Snefru in ancient Egyptian history. Now, eventually the power of the pharaohs declined and ended the Old Kingdom. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time looking at that specifically, but just like any other civilization, if you don't have leadership that can keep you intact, that can keep invading armies out, you will certainly succumb to some type of decline. And that's exactly what happened here. A little anticlimactic, but you know, it happens, and Egypt will persevere, as we're going to see a little bit of the Middle Kingdom, but we're going to focus heavily on the New Kingdom here later in this unit. But since we've established a couple of pyramids from the Old Kingdom and a couple of pharaohs, let's focus on the culture. Certainly when we think of Egyptian culture, I think most people think of the Great Pyramids at Giza, they think of the Sphinx. The biggest of the Great Pyramids at Giza was built by Khufu, which you can see here in the background. He was another important pharaoh. So his pyramid, of course, is one of the most iconic images in the entire world. Some of you know what this is from. Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen. Never happened. What was kind of cool, though, as I read about this, this was the first time any Hollywood movie production had been allowed to film on the pyramids in like 50 years or something like that. So granted, this is special effects, but the pyramid itself is the real pyramid. They did not use CGI to recreate the pyramids in that film. That was really kind of a first for Hollywood in quite some time. Of course, there were never giant robots from outer space, but it's kind of fun to see the pyramids in pop culture. Speaking of pop culture, if you've ever been to Las Vegas, and I've been several times, they have a really cool resort out there called the Luxor Hotel. The Luxor Hotel is built as a giant pyramid. They even have a sphinx out front. If you look inside of it, it's got a very big Egyptian theme. It's a really pretty cool place. In fact, I went to a really good taco bar. I think it was right up in here. My wife and I had some really good guacamole there. But that's beside the point. What this really shows us is that people like Egypt. People like their culture. It's been around for so long, obviously, but it's so unique. The song that I played at the beginning of this lecture was Walk Like an Egyptian from the Bangles, very popular song in the 80s. So Egyptian culture has just kind of become a part of us. Not that I want to continue on the gambling theme here, but if you ever do go to a casino, you're going to see several different ancient Egyptian-themed slot machines. Again, I'm not trying to promote that, but it just shows us that pop culture really likes the Egyptians. So a lot of tourism, certainly in Egypt, but certainly in other places like Las Vegas and elsewhere around the globe. Now let's talk a little bit about Egyptian culture here. They were led by pharaohs. Egyptian pharaohs ruled absolutely. The pharaohs stood at the center of Egyptian culture, government, and religion. You know, some cultures have different leaders. They have kings or emperors or you name it. The pharaoh is kind of unique to Egypt. They did a lot of different things. They certainly were rulers, could rule the army. They could command religious ceremonies and lots of things like that. And in fact, when we have a government in which it's based on religious authority like this, that's called a theocracy. So your government and your religion, in many cases in ancient Egypt, were as one, because your religious leader was your government leader, your pharaoh. They all assumed the same role. The Egyptians were polytheistic. I mentioned that in part one. That means they believed in many different gods. A couple examples for you. We've got Ra, the sun god, Osiris, god of the dead. Goddess Isis was someone who represented the ideal mother and wife. We said the Nile was worshipped as a god. Sometimes the pharaohs are worshipped as gods, and you'll see that as we study the important pharaohs of the New Kingdom. They had a very strong belief in the afterlife. We know this because they built burial chambers in tombs. They actually believed that these pharaohs lived in these burial chambers that were built for them. So they needed stuff. They needed gold. They needed water. They needed servants down in there. There were times where servants were buried along with them, even if the servants weren't dead. So we know that the afterlife was a very big part of Egyptian culture. Now, in order to place somebody in a burial chamber, they had to be mummified. So mummification is the embalming and drying of corpses to prevent decay. Basically what you did is you took out the main organs, the lungs, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, etc. You salted them for a couple of weeks so they would dry out, and then you would let the body dry out too, and then you would put those organs back into the body so that bodies tend to rot and decay, so you have less of that. So then they wrapped them in bandages, and that really preserved them. And we found some of these pharaohs that still have hair and skin on them. They were that well preserved. So here's a couple of images of some mummies. I'm not exactly sure which pharaohs these are, but it's just an example. You can kind of see here. This image is not the best, but you can definitely see some skin and hair still on that particular mummy. A little more of the pop culture aspect of the Egyptians, two films, The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. Not a lot of history in them, but certainly based around this historical period. So pretty entertaining. Check them out. A little bit older now, but still entertaining. Egyptian society. Now, you're going to probably want to pause it here because I'm going to have you fill this out on your notes packet. But this is what Egyptian society looked like in terms of their social structure. You got your pharaoh at your top, your viziers or viziers, your high priests, nobles, officials, scribes, craftsmen, and of course slaves, laborers, and peasants at the bottom. Now, the vizier was Pharaoh's most trusted advisor, so naturally they would be towards the top. So if you need to pause this to write this all down in your notes, go ahead and do so. I'm going to continue on here. One of the things that's cool about Egyptian culture is they were not locked into social classes. There was some social mobility. They could move up or down. Very rarely did you move up to be a pharaoh, of course, but you weren't, if you were born a laborer, that didn't mean you were a laborer for your entire life. Although that probably happened in a lot of cases, there were people who were able to move up. And women held many of the same rights as men, which is pretty cool. Women could propose marriage, and often they married young, but oftentimes if there was some type of divorce, and that did happen in Egyptian culture, the woman was entitled to 1/3 of the couple's property. Now that doesn't sound even, that's not equal, but the fact that the woman got anything was pretty remarkable because in a lot of cultures that wouldn't happen. So women did have many of the same rights as men. Now, in terms of what we know about the Egyptians, we've learned a lot from their written language, from their hieroglyphics. So Egyptians wrote using hieroglyphics or carvings of symbols and pictographs. You can see all of these here. There's lots of different examples of hieroglyphics. So symbols stood for ideas instead of words. So sometimes a symbol could stand for a word. Sometimes it meant a whole phrase. They often also wrote on something called papyrus reeds. They invented a writing surface out of papyrus reeds. Basically what you did is you took these reeds out of the Nile. They were thick and they were kind of round, and you sliced them really thin, and you wove them together just like a mat. And then you placed a large stone on top of them, and you left it there for several days, and that would certainly press it flat, but all the sap in the papyrus reeds would kind of bind it all together so that when you took that stone off and it dried, you would have a very thin writing surface like paper that could be rolled up as a scroll and certainly be used for written purposes. The Egyptians were known to have some pretty cool scientific things. They created a 365-day calendar with 12 months of 30 days, so pretty spot on with where we are today. And we know that from their hieroglyphics, we know that Egyptian doctors knew about the human pulse. They knew how to set broken bones, and even in some cases use surgery. I can't imagine it was real advanced surgery. It's probably what we would have called exploratory surgery. That's what they used to do before we had a lot of our scientific equipment. You knew something was wrong, you'd go in there and you'd try to remove the blockage or the problem, and then you'd sew the person back up. So that's pretty remarkable that they were able to do that back in the Egyptian Empire. So that brings us to our end. The result here is the Egyptians had accomplished something no one else had ever done. They built one of the first truly unique united empires on the planet. We haven't seen anything like this. I mean, we've seen other cultures build things, but nothing similar to the pyramids, especially with their burial chambers. And we haven't seen mummification. The hieroglyphics really set them apart. There are other groups that use versions of hieroglyphics, but they come much, much later. So the Egyptians really, truly were unique. Okay, let's wrap up by taking another look at our constructive response questions. Our first question says, summarize the geography of Egypt and its surrounding lands. Well, you can't talk about the geography of Egypt without talking about the Nile River. The Nile River is one of the longest rivers in the world, 4,100 miles long. One of the most interesting characteristics of the Nile is it flows north. So it flows north to the Mediterranean Sea, and that actually flip-flops two regions of Egypt. Egypt was broken down into Upper and Lower Egypt. Well, you would normally think Upper Egypt would be in the north, but in this case it was not due to the way the Nile flows. So if you can picture the Mediterranean Sea, just south of that would be the Lower Egypt, because that's where the Nile flows towards, and just south of that would be Upper Egypt. So they are flip-flopped. And of course, south of there you have Nubia, because the question does say, describe the surrounding lands. Well, if you go a few miles in any direction past the Nile, you're going to hit desert, so we need to talk about how there's lots of desert in Egypt. Certainly, we already mentioned the Mediterranean Sea, but to the east we have the Red Sea, which will factor into our story on Judaism a little bit later on. But the Nile is a little bit different. They knew kind of when each year it would flood, and that was unlike Mesopotamia. They didn't necessarily know how much it would flood, but they kind of knew about each time of year when it would flood, and that was definitely useful. So we've got a lot of good information to answer that question. Second question says, describe Egyptian culture, including details in their government, religion, and social structure. Well, we don't want to limit ourselves, but we want to definitely talk about those three things. So their government was a theocracy, which is a government based on religious authority. Their religion was polytheistic. They believed in many gods, like Ra, the sun god, and Osiris, and Isis, and things like that. Not Isis in the way that we see in the modern world. That's completely different. And their social structure really is they had a pharaoh at the top and slaves at the bottom. I mean, that's really kind of indicative of their culture. Other things we can mention here, they used hieroglyphics to write. They mummified bodies. They had big tombs, most of which were pyramids, at least in the Old Kingdom days, for their pharaohs and other important people. And so they built these burial chambers where they really believed these people lived in the afterlife. They used a lot of gold on different objects. So we've got a lot of different cultural pieces that we can use there to talk about the Egyptians. So, gang, that's going to do it for us today. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.